Everyone out there, welcome back to Capital Connections, MEC's webinar series. We're doing something a little different this time and pretty special. We're doing a legacy interview of State Representative Rebekah Warren, who is serving her last term in the Michigan Legislature. She is one of the rare lawmakers to have served full terms in both the House and the Senate, 14 years of legislative service, and she is the only lawmaker this year who is term limited with that kind of tenure. During Rebekah's time in the Capitol, which includes not just her 14 years of legislative service, but also time leading a advocacy nonprofit and serving in on the staffs of lawmakers. That's where she got some of her own training. She's done some incredible things for the environment, and we want to celebrate her service. Thank you for her 14 years. Here are some of the insider stories about how big packages came to be and critical battles were fought. And we're going to talk a little bit towards the end of the webinar about what it takes from a strategic perspective for lawmakers who we want to hold to our values to do that in this environment, and what she sees on the horizon for environmental policy making looking forward. Rebekah Warren, thank you for joining us.
It is such a pleasure to be here.
So for those of you out there, again, here's a couple protocol things that I will almost certainly mess up during the course of this webinar. One, because Rebekah served in both the Senate and the House, tradition says you use the title of her highest office. So once she's out of office on December 31st, January 1st, she'll be Senator Warren for the remainder of her time, unless she chooses higher office yet. But Rebekah and I have had a long personal history together. My very first job in politics, she was in an office down the hall from me. And so I tend to call her Rebekah. So Senator, Representative Rebekah, please know all of those titles are issued with affection and respect as we go along today.
Anything is fine, absolutely.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about how you got your start here. You, as I said, have been in the legislative seat, but you've also been in the staff seat. And that's really how it all started out, right? Right out of college, or excuse me, while you were still in college, you came to the Michigan Legislature.
It's true, and this year marks my 27th year of working in the Capitol in Lansing, which is you know, with a little bit of vanity, one of those things you hate to admit, that you could have had a career already that has spanned 27 years in Lansing and be doing a legacy event when sometimes I still feel like I'm in my 20s inside. But yeah, right when I was in college, and it's a kind of a fun start because it's a name that some of your participants here today might know well. But I was getting my undergrad from the University of Michigan, and I was in a program where they assigned you an alumni mentor. And the alumni mentor that was assigned to me through that program was Greg Petoniak. So, as you know, Conan, obviously someone who's been very engaged in lots of, I thought you were going to say what his current job was, sorry, like, because you work with him at SEMCA, right?
And,
like,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, but at the time, Greg Petoniak was serving as state representative for an area downriver. He had, you know, Romulus and
Taylor, right?
Taylor, right? He had come out of Taylor city government. So Greg was my alumni mentor, and we went and had coffee. And I was, you know, 21 years old and had no idea what I wanted to do when I grew up. And Greg, over coffee, said, "Have you ever thought about politics?" And to be honest, I really hadn't, right? Like, this was not something that was on my radar, like, you know, sort of going into work in Lansing at that point. But Greg said, "I really would like to introduce you to your state representative." And he said, "I think you would have a lot in common." And I've never forgotten this phrase that he used 3 adjectives. He's like, "Your state representative is smart and funny and liberal. I think you'll have a lot in common." And I remembered thinking at 21, am I smart and funny and liberal? Are those three things that define me? And of course, he did set up an introduction to my state representative, who was Mary Schroer at the time. And she invited me to do an internship in her office. So while I was still finishing up my bachelor's degree in Ann Arbor, I was commuting 2 days a week to her Lansing office for an unpaid, and at that time, really, I wasn't even doing it for credit internship. It was just for the experience. And I have to say, I've become such a cheerleader for internships. I tell people all the time now, as my career has developed, like, do internships, because it really is a wonderful on-the-job opportunity to find out if this is a career or a job that you would like. And I just getting very close to the end of my internship in our office, and I remembered thinking, I'm not getting paid. I'm actually paying money to drive up there, to like park, to buy my lunch, to do all that. Have I lost my mind? Am I crazy? And the day after I graduated, so I had a big house graduation. Those of you know my reference, my local Ann Arbor-area. It's a big house graduation on Saturday. On Sunday, Mary called me and said, I have a full-time position in my office. It starts Monday if you want it. And I started. So 21 years old. I've been working ever since in the Capitol.
Mary Schroer was part of what we like to call the Lanapolic Mafia. Lanapolic's near and dear to MEC. She was our president and CEO for better than a decade, and before that served in the Michigan Senate, where she mentored a lot of women into public office. You were part of that legacy, right? Mary Schroer worked for Lana.
Yes, very affectionately, we do call it the Lanapolic Mafia, and always for good, all good, or good trouble, to borrow one of our favorite John Lewis sayings. But yeah, it was. It is not lost on me that these are the giants on whose shoulders that I stand, and coming behind Lanapolic. And you referenced, Conan, my service in the state Senate. Lana in 1982 won the Senate seat that covers most of Washtenaw County, and passed it on to amazing women, one after another. And when I was serving in the state Senate, it was the longest held Senate seat by women in Michigan's history. So we've still never been beaten. And those of you who know the area know Jeff Irwin followed me into my House seat. So when I ran for the Senate, he ran for the House seat and won. And then when I ran, when I was leaving by term limits, the Senate seat, he ran behind me and won that. So we broke our streak there. But it is, in Michigan's history, the longest held Senate seat by women. And all started with Lanapolic. So
one of the other dear friends, the environmental movement, had a big influence on your personal history as well, Tom Cook.
Yes. So I grew up in Shiawassee County, and the Cook Foundation and those who know that, right, know that they're, and I think Tom's father, but huge boosters for the University of Michigan. And the town I grew up in was pretty small. And, I did good in school. I graduated at the top of my class, and didn't really know quite where I wanted to go for college, but I was, growing up in a small town, a little uncertain about going to the University of Michigan with its, enormous size and slightly scary campus for a girl from a small town. And every year they took a group, the top 10, not 10%, but the top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of the graduating class to Ann Arbor, and try to convince them to, as huge boosters, to decide to come to the University of Michigan. So it was on one of those trips sponsored by them that I came to Ann Arbor and, did the machinations that ended up feeling like I could have a niche there. So
I want to invite folks to throw questions into the chat as we go along, and I'll try and pepper Rebekah with them. There's a lot of ground to cover over the next little hour. So, I want you guys to get a chance to put your questions out there too. Rebekah, when you and I first started working together with any seriousness, I was a writer in the House of Representatives, and you were Mary Schroer's chief of staff at that moment. One of the issues that I had to learn from scratch about, but had been very active in your office, was around Eurasian milfoil, an invasive species. Tell us a little bit about how you cut your teeth on that environmental policy 30 years ago.
Well, I think for a lot of folks who have enjoyed Michigan's many, inland lakes, this is an issue that's been plaguing us for a while. That these invasive species, whether they be sort of animal life or plant life, have really changed the character of some of the ecosystems that we've held dear. And in Mary's office, in my early 20s, there were a couple of inland lakes in Washtenaw County that were just really, suffering serious infestations of Eurasian milfoil. And we were just then, right, this was the very early sort of phases of us understanding some of these aquatic invasive species, especially of the plant variety, and how to treat them. So there was, and what we do to make sure that we're not, doing further damage to the ecosystems by treating them with chemicals or by introducing new predators that would then throw the ecosystem out of balance. But it really was a constituent concern. We had constituents who lived on a couple of these inland lakes that were, seeing the typical sort of wildlife being choked out by this particular, invasive species, and we're looking for some help. And so what we ended up working on and getting moved through the legislature at that time was, Mary Schroer's focus was not to be punitive to the boaters and watercraft, enthusiasts who were taking jet skis or little speedboats or what from lake to lake, and that's how we were finding the milfoil was traveling. Right, it was in a prop or a propeller of a small watercraft. She wasn't looking to be super punitive. She was really looking to up the education. And so we did some research, found out, some ways that we could help educate our inland water users on how to clean your watercraft. And it was one of the first invasive species statutes that we had in the state that provided, education to boaters and small watercraft users on sort of like what we all now sort of know is that sort of don't bring hitchhikers, right? Make sure you clean off your boats or your jet skis before you go into another inland lake so that you don't take anything invasive with you. And that was something we worked on in Mary's office, like you said, not quite 30 years ago, Conan, come on, 27, 30 is still far, far away, but 20, 25, 26, 27 years ago.
So you've got this fantastic training from Mary Schroer, an education at the University of Michigan, supported in part by Tom Cook's introduction, the legacy of Lana Pollock and her policy leadership. And then some years later, suddenly you are yourself in the House of Representatives, ready to roll with public policy, and you get appointed to be the chair of the Great Lakes and Environment Committee right off the bat.
So fun story. This is one that some of your participants today might have heard me tell before, but it's just so a fun one because to be successful as a legislator and a legislative staffer, right? You just by definition have to be a generalist. Lots of different issues come across your desk every day that you have to respond to. So I had been chief of staff at that point in my career to two different Democratic state representatives, right? Mary Schroer and her focus on a lot of focus on women's rights and equality issues, on sensible gun policy. So some of the biggest issues we worked on were in sort of that space. Then worked for Hubert Price from Pontiac for a couple of years. He was the Democratic chair of appropriations. So I ran all the budgets for him for a couple of years. So I had this really diverse background. When I left the legislature, I ran for 7 years, the oldest and largest grassroots nonprofit supporting women's reproductive health and justice. So when I got elected to the legislature, although I had worked on environmental issues before, I didn't have any deep credentials particularly in environmental science or in sort of natural resource protection or advocacy at all. And in a kind of a surprise, Democrats, my party, took control of the House for the first time in 8 years in 2006 when I was first elected. And for the first time in Michigan's history, two women who were first termers, so two freshman women, got gavels to chair committee. I was one of two. And I would say this, if my speaker, Andy Dillon, were standing here right beside me, I honestly think he gave me the chair of the Great Lakes and Environment Committee because I was a liberal woman from Ann Arbor, not because I had credentials to be there. I always joke, I think, to Andy with his Redford Township sort of background, his idea of Ann Arbor as this sort of, liberal wonderland. I think he thought, well, she's from Ann Arbor and she's liberal. She must hug trees and smoke pot and wear Birkenstocks, and therefore the Environment Committee is the place for her to land. So, and in telling that story, I always say, I love the outdoors and I'm happy to hug a tree, and I'm the chair of the Stiletto Caucus. I never wear Birkenstocks. And third, that's all legal now, so we don't need to talk about that one anymore. So. But I was the accidental, in some ways, the accidental environment chair, and anybody who's ever met me knows I am a hardworking woman who dots her I's, crosses her T's, doesn't ever want to embarrass myself, didn't want to embarrass my speaker by not knowing what I needed to know. So from the very first week that I got the gavel to chair the Great Lakes and Environment Committee, I convened lots and lots of folks. I met with Lana Pollock, who was then the president of MEC. I met with James Clift, your fantastic policy director, right? And worked with him. I met with, and I felt so lucky coming from Ann Arbor, right? Having so many organizations headquartered here, many of whom are your member organizations, right? I met with the folks from the Michigan Legal Conservation Voters, from the National Wildlife Federation, from the ecology center, right? Met with the ecology center, met with all these folks. And I was like, what do I need to know to be good at this? And just to put it in perspective for folks, the week that this announcement was made that I would be chairing the Great Lakes and Environment Committee, I started getting requests to speak on panels, like international panels, right? Because as the chair of the Great Lakes Committee in the Great Lakes state, people all around this basin are really interested in what you have to say. So I kind of went back to school. I really just learned everything that I needed to know, by meeting with your organization. So thank you, MEC, for helping prepare me to be, to wield that gavel, and to all your member organizations that educated me on those things. And this leads sort of into my first big thing that I worked on. So I'd been the chair for about 6 weeks maybe, and we'd had some first hearings on some issues that I know are also near and dear to your heart and to many of your member groups' heart, on solid waste planning and recycling. We started to have some hearings on what it would take to increase the tipping fee and use those found resources to invest in recycling programs throughout the state. And I was having one of these hearings, and afterwards somebody came up to me who I had not met yet, who another name that many of your folks probably know, Cam Davis, who was then with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, became Obama's Great Lakes czar, all around just great environmental advocate and good guy, and said, hey, so we have this thing that we've all been working on for about 10 years. What do you think about, we think the issue's ready, we think the timing's right. What do you think about working on the Great Lakes Compact? And I had no idea what I didn't know about that, and that really started the work. Of course, if we need to work on the Great Lakes Compact, let's work on the Great Lakes Compact. And to this day, 14 years elected later, having a binational treaty, like how many times do state legislators work on, literally international treaties that have to both get through at that time, democratically held state house, Republican held state Senate, be signed into law by then Governor Jennifer Granholm, so Democratic governor. Then we had to take it to Washington and get it through both chambers of Congress and get signed into law. It actually got signed into law in 2008 by President Bush before he left office, obviously with Obama coming in January of 2009. So that was one of the first big projects that I ever worked on, was kind of really a seminal piece of policy for my entire career.
I want to delve into that story a little bit. Can you just briefly give folks an overview of what the compact's major work is?
Yeah, so the thing about the compact is really it's two sets of work, right? It's the compact itself, which, an agreement among states about really the focus was banning diversions from the Great Lake Basin for water, and there was a lot of focus at the time, if folks can remember, that far back to 2007, 2008. There was a lot of pressure we had lots of droughts in Atlanta. We had a Governor Richardson from New Mexico talking about wanting to put a pipeline to the Great Lakes, right? There was a lot of pressure on us in the Great Lakes Basin to sort of share our freshwater resource with others around the country. And what a little bit tipped the scale, I think, at that time, obviously these conversations were helping people really focus on, what is possible? How do we protect the Great Lakes from these kinds of water quantity issues, right? Water diversions. And at that time, there was this Asian nation that had this idea of sending, think of a big oil tanker, right? Like that go across the oceans full of gallons, hundreds and hundreds of, thousands of gallons of oil. They want to take one of these tankers, bring it to the Great Lakes, fill it up with Great Lakes water, and take it back to their nation. And this seemed to be the sort of thumb on the scale that really fired people up to say, are they allowed to do that? And at that time, of course, they were allowed to do that. There was nothing on the books, no agreement about water quantity between the Great Lakes states, the 8 Great Lakes states and 2 Canadian provinces. So the compact itself, sort of in some ways the easier part of the lift of the package. So we all had to sign the same exact agreement. We had to pass the same statute. We couldn't change we couldn't name it the Rebekah Warren and Patty Burkholz compact, right? We couldn't change a period or anything. We had to pass it as is. But the compact also required that every participating jurisdiction have implementation language for it that basically deal with water withdrawals ourselves. So we couldn't say, other nations who are not in the basin, you can't take or states in our nation that are not in the basin, you can't take water from the Great Lakes, but we can do whatever we want with it, right? We had to prove that we're being good stewards of the resource that's in our shared backyard. And so the water withdrawal legislation was the hard part. And those of you who paid attention at the time will know that this, Michigan ended up being the last of the 8 Great Lakes states to ratify the compact. And in some ways, some people found that embarrassing. That is the Great Lakes state, that we have the largest percentage of our landmass in the basin, of course, than any other state does. Some people thought it was embarrassing that we were the last state to ratify. But the important thing was, my then counterpart in the Senate, Senator Patty Burkholz, and I said, if we pass the compact first, and we don't pass the implementation legislation, we weren't sure when we would be able to get back to it or when we could put the coalition together to pass it. We did both at the same time. We're the only state in the nation to do that. So when we passed the compact, we passed the implementation legislation and we had the whole thing done. Some states still, honestly, are still working on some pieces of the implementation legislation, almost 14, 13 years later. So we were very wise, I think, to have done that. And so the withdrawal legislation, right, is an interesting package of bills to work on in a state like Michigan, where we have so much water, right? Like wherever you are in Michigan, you're not more than 6 miles from a body of water. We're not used to talking about conservation. So we had to start talking about different issues with stakeholders than we ever had to before. So it was a really interesting process. And I'll say, I know you want to ask a question, but I'll just say one more thing and I'll let you ask. A reporter asked me once when we got all the way through and we had the bills were signed, in Washington, signed by President Bush. A reporter asked me, was there ever a moment where you felt like the wheels were going to come off the bus? Use that exact analogy. Was there ever a moment where you felt like the wheels were going to come off the bus and you and Senator Burkholz were not going to be able to pass this legislation? And I remembered in the moment sort of laughing and thinking, a large percentage of the time, I never felt like there was even wheels on the bus. I felt like the bus was up on blocks in the front yard because it really was it was one of the hardest things we've ever had to do, was to try to thread the needle to be able to get that legislation passed.
You mentioned Patty Burkholz, iconic representative and senator herself. Iconic not just for her leadership, but for the color purple. She represented coastal communities on the west side of the state, pretty conservative Republican. The two of you, however, set the standard for bipartisan negotiation that really continued onto other policies. And I don't think it is, I think it is fair to say it's special that you were both women too. You brought a different lens on how conversations about public policy should happen, and how debates and conflict should be managed. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with Patty and how you guys managed to work across the aisle?
Yeah, that's a good question. And when we got started working together, she was obviously Senate chair of the Committee of Jurisdiction. They called it Natural Resources at the time. So she chaired Natural Resources. I chaired Great Lakes and the Environment in the House. And there's a picture of the ceremonial signing of the compact. Governor Granholm came to both of our districts at different points and took pictures with us. Now I represent, I represented at the time a pretty compact urban district, wholly within the city of Ann Arbor. The Huron River is the water, the backdrop to my district. Patty's district ran from just outside of Lansing, all from like Delta Township, all the way to the shores of Lake Michigan. So Oval Beach in Saugatuck was in her district. And so this speaking of iconic, so this iconic picture of Governor Granholm, Senator Burkholz, and myself with a beautiful sunny day. You couldn't have requested you couldn't have ordered up a more beautiful Michigan day. The powder puff, sandy beaches of Oval Beach, and the governor signing that. And we had a lot of folks say, it did, and has been called in the press, the most significant piece of environmental legislation in 40 years. And it took 3 women to sort of get it across the finish line and make it happen. And Patty and I didn't have any previous relationship. We hadn't worked together on anything. So when I came in and we started working together, we were building a relationship from scratch. We didn't know each other. She didn't have any reason to trust me. I had no reason to trust her. But we decided very early on in the process of the compact that we had shared goals, the shared goal of passing both the compact and the implementation legislation, and that we were going to continue to work together and to speak to make sure that we were doing everything that we could do to get it done. So what I've learned in 27 years in working in Lansing is that there's an enormous inertia for the status quo, that any kind of change across the board to any policy can be very difficult. And there were a lot of folks who did not want Patty and I to be successful in getting this passed and getting the implementation language done at the same time. And Patty and I ended up, we each did our drive from home to Lansing every day that we had session and committee. We had about an hour in the morning, each of us commute to Lansing. And we ended up talking nearly every day for a period of time while we were working on this legislation. And we invested in each other and we told each other the stories of, oh, I just heard from this stakeholder that you're going back on your word and you're going to move something through your committee today that is not what we agreed upon. And I would say, no, Patty, I'm going to do what I said I was going to do. I'm keeping my word. And then the next day I'd hear from some stakeholder that was trying to derail us, right? That she was doing something that she hadn't said. So honestly, we just were committed. We were committed to getting it done. We were committed to making sure that people's voices were heard. And we were committed to having conversations every day, multiple times a day, if we needed to make sure we were on the same page. Now, Patty and I did not always agree. And there were some pretty considerable battles along the way where we each had to sort of, use the power of our gavel and our committee to keep fighting for what we believed in. And one of the ones for me was, Michigan has some, award-winning cold water trout streams, right? We have some of the most amazing trout streams in the world. People come from all over the globe to fish here. And one of the things that that they were urging was, a standard that would have allowed up to 25% of cold water streams water to be taken and used as part of this withdrawal statute and this tool that we were creating. And for a lot of advocates, obviously, some of your members, Trout Unlimited, the Anglers of the Ensemble, like some of these wonderful groups that are part of your organization, were coming to me saying, Rebekah, this would change the ecosystem. Like, this would change the habitat. This would be so detrimental that these streams would disappear. They'd never be the same again.
Right.
And it's one of the ones I had to like draw the line in the sand with Patty and say, absolutely not. I'm not going to sign off on any bill that does that kind of significant change to the ecosystem, to something that's so special about Michigan. And we had to pass out of the House a more restrictive bill to show her that we had the political will to do it, and that we were going to put Michigan's natural resources first above what maybe some agriculture stakeholders or some other manufacturing stakeholders were encouraging her to do. And we ended up winning that one. And this is part of the relationship, right? You can be hardworking in this job. You can try to read everything that comes across your desk in this job. But when all is said and done, on any given day, in 5-minute or less increments, you're voting on things as diverse as tax policy and agriculture and education and healthcare. And you need people that you can trust and count on to tell you in the moment what the details of something really mean, and how and where to sort of stick that flag in the ground. Your voting record is yours forever. You need trusted advisors. And it's an old reference, but I would say in my Rolodex, right? In my Rolodex, now in my phone where all the contacts live, there have been so many times over my 14 years elected where I've been able to call, MEC, one of your members, one of the sort of advisors who know this stuff, who it's the only thing they do every day, all day long, and say, hey, something about this amendment just doesn't smell right. What am I seeing here? What am I smelling here? And get that answer right away. So I appreciate the recognition of the work that I've done, but I tell you, it's not just a one-woman show. I could not have done everything I've done for protecting our environment and natural resources over 14 years elected without the support of you, Conan, your organization, and so many of your member groups. So as much as you're saying thank you to me today, I'm saying thank you right back, because I wouldn't be here without you all.
We like being part of that team, that's for sure. During the compact negotiation, you built a reputation for intelligence and toughness, but also being able to work across the aisle. And shortly after that, Michigan faced a pretty enormous challenge with funding for its state park system. Our facilities were dilapidated, and these were jewels. These were places that had deep, deep history. Hemingway wrote about these places, and we had let them fall into disrepair. We weren't funding the DNR budget sufficiently to maintain them, and there was not a willingness in the legislature to raise taxes or really to generate any kind of revenue. And yet, once again, you found a way to reach across the aisle and create the Michigan Parks Passport System, which has transformed the funding rubric for our state parks.
And you started to thread a needle here that I didn't pick up from you, Conan, but I should, which is that the relationship with Patty that was created out of the good work that we did around the compact created kind of a string of, if you sort of took a look at the bipartisan environmental and natural resource protection legislation that got passed at that time, Patty and I worked together on a set of diverse areas, from water to parks to wetlands to electronic waste recycling, right? We took on a whole bunch of these, and honestly, the first renewable portfolio standard, so in the energy space as well. We took on a lot of issues that once we had built our relationship, and found that shared focus and shared value, we were able to continue to build on that as long as we served together. And the Parks Passport was one of those issues, right? Like this was, again, reminding ourselves that this was the height of the Great Recession. The two of the big three auto manufacturers were filing bankruptcy. We had a humongous hole in our state budget, and we'd been disinvesting from our state parks for a number of years. And we'd gotten to the point where there was no general fund dollars from the state going into the parks at all. And you mentioned, the parks were dilapidated. We had parks that had building roofs that were caving in. We had a bridge at Warren Dunes that had gone out. So the closest parking lot that you could park and get to the water was almost a mile walk. And for people who are bringing children and coolers and, it's just not, it's certainly not the day at the beach that you're hoping for, if that's kind of where you are. And that was a really important puzzle for us to solve. And we could have an argument about what should be general fund supported. And I would have a fun conversation with you and many others, I think, about that. But in the moment, there just wasn't general fund to put to it anyway. So we used part of a wonderful infrastructure of a citizens committee, right? We had a citizens committee that studied parks alternatives, and they looked around the country for best practices, what folks were doing. And the example of the Parks Passport was something that had happened in Montana. And we thought this is something that could really work in Michigan. And so at the time it was, you pay $10 when you renew your vehicle tabs every year, and it is your entry into the 100+ state parks around the state with that one-time fee. And at the time, the day rate was $9 a day, and it was getting ready to go up from there. So we thought it was from $7 to $9. So we're saying this is really, financially, it's a win for our residents who want to go, to the parks. And we had two goals when we introduced it. We had two goals. We had one goal was to find a stable funding stream for our state parks. And the second goal was to increase usership, right? We really wanted to find something that would encourage people. And if you had a Parks Passport and you lived, not that far from a state park, would you take your lunch there on a beautiful day? If you didn't have to think, I have to pay $9 every time I go, but you've already paid it, we really thought that this is something that would work. And when we did the math, we needed 17% of our Michigan motorists to sign up in order to keep the funding level with the old system. And by the end of the first year, 25% of all vehicles in Michigan were registered with a recreation passport. So just the first year alone, we really surpassed our goal. Participation rates now are over 33%. So, and we've heard from a lot of folks like, oh, I just put it on all my vehicles, even if I don't, in a family that maybe has a couple of adults and maybe a kid who drives a car, they're like, well, we put it on all of them. And that way we can take whatever car we want, or it's the $10, it's indexed to inflation. So it's $11 now, but, to support the parks. And we have surpassed, again, within the second year, we surpassed the number of campground nights, like overnight stays at our state campgrounds, that to the highest level we'd ever gotten before. So we really feel good that we financially have done what we wanted to do. We've got a stable revenue stream for the parks, and we have increased usership in parks all around the state. So that was another success.
Working with Patty was comparatively easy. She shared many of the values that you have for natural resource protection. When you moved into the Senate 4 years later, you found yourself in a very different political environment. You were in the minority in the Senate. The Republicans had taken control of the House, and we had a Republican governor. And you had in the Natural Resources Committee as your chair, Tom Casperson from the Upper Peninsula. And Tom, in environmental and conservation circles, is renowned for his opposition to regulation and to the work that we would do on a day-to-day to protect those interests. And yet, even with Tom, you found ways to do hard battle with him and make some good progress. And I'm thinking specifically of the Regional Transit Authority in Detroit, where both of you collaborated on public policy for a transformative policy for Southeast Michigan.
Yeah, so I have a really interesting distinction. I'm, a liberal from Ann Arbor. I've been named the most liberal member of the chamber that I've served in, more than a dozen times in my time elected. So I'm the left of my party. And at the same time, I had more bills signed into law in the minority than any other member of the minority of either chamber. So some people find that a really interesting thing, or a puzzle that they can't figure out. How can you be the left of the left, be a standard bearer for these liberal values, and still get things done? Often that person is a gadfly, right? Somebody who doesn't, who can throw a wrench into the works, but not actually move the gears forward. And for me,
that's a great anecdote, and it's exactly what I want you to talk about. It's like you had to do battle with people like Tom every single day and still get things done. So yeah, tell us about how those relationships developed in such a way that you could still have a trusting relationship with someone who was very, very much on the opposite side of you.
So I think two things really guide me every day in all of this work. So the first one is what I think the job is, right? I think the job is the citizens of Ann Arbor, of Broward, Washtenaw County, that I've represented for 14 years, send me to Lansing to move Michigan forward. They want me to be doing something productive for us, sort of taking care of our neighbors, taking care of our state, like moving things forward. So I take that charge very seriously, that I'm not sent to Lansing just to be the one no vote. And sometimes you have to be the one lone no vote when it really matters, but that's not the whole job. I'm not just supposed to throw bombs, or not just supposed to be a no vote. I'm supposed to be doing, that's what the job is, moving Michigan forward. The second thing is I really take this very golden rule approach to treating people how I want to be treated. And in that sort of second silo here, I have been 100% committed, and you can look through any clip of any press anywhere. I've never made it personal with my colleagues. I've never said, colleague A is an idiot, or they have bad values or anything. I've never been quoted saying that, because I don't say that. I look at the policy. I say the policy is wrongheaded, or that the policy has unintended or intended consequences that are going to be detrimental. But by never making it personal to the person, you live to fight another day, right? Like, and I'll be honest, in this business that I've made my career, you don't get to this level of elected politics without having some kind of ego. And I say that as a person who thinks she doesn't have a very big one, but you can't put your name on the ballot and ask people to vote for you as the best option and not have a little bit of an ego, or a big ego. And I find that there's a very strong correlative relationship between people with big egos and very thin skin. So it's just very good to just be very cautious, right? So some of these, I had to do a lot of battles with Senator Casperson, and he was a very prolific chair. We had committee every week. We had lots of different issues, and what changed for me, I know you're a nonpartisan organization. You probably got people from both parties like listening in here, so this is not meant to be a partisan comment, but I have served in the majority and had a gavel and got to set an agenda for an environmental committee. And I have served in the minority and had to play defense for 8, now moving into 12 years of my 10 years of my career. It is much better to be in the majority. It is much better to have a gavel and be able to set an agenda and work on the policies you want. I spent my 8 years in the Senate working with Tom Casperson. I felt like I played defense every week, right? I went to committee prepared to try to defend against the worst things that might be coming, and to try to redefine victory to make some policies a little bit less worse, right? If it was going to pass anyway, try to work in the margins to make things less harmful to our environment, to our natural resources, to our citizens, public health. And again, by always being respectful of where my colleagues are coming from, him in particular, and knowing that logging and mining and some of these issues are a way of life and a way of employment for a lot of his constituents. Always respecting that, but pushing back on things that I thought would be harmful. We were able then to find those places like the RTA where we could agree, and I'd never burn that bridge, and so we could work on those things together. So
as you think about the legislature in the future, what advice would you give to future lawmakers in terms of finding that ground? Like, what does it take in terms of personal fortitude? What are the tactics that have been successful for you in building those relationships across the aisle?
well, I think that is the key, Conan, is that, this is a relationship business. I mean, like many, but this one in particular. And what's been helpful for me is really having invested the time to get to know my colleagues. Knowing who their kids are, what their kids are doing, what their spouse is doing, what's important to them personally. I invested a lot of time, especially really early in my career, and I would say for the first couple years of my elected service, I learned more and made more progress between 5 p.m. and 9 p.m. than I did between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Like it went to a lot of the receptions that people have, went to the policy seminars that people were putting on, spending time over a cup of coffee with colleagues or over a meal with colleagues to get to know them and what's important, invest in each other. I challenged myself also when I was in the Senate that I wanted to find, and reminding, the backdrop, we were in the super minority when I was in, literally Republican Party had a super majority when I was in the Senate. My party was in the super minority. There were only like 11, 12 of us at different points when I was serving. And I was one of only 4 women the entire time that I served in the Senate. The first 4 years, our now Governor Gretchen Whitmer was my colleague in the Democratic caucus. There's 2 Democratic women, 2 Republican women. My last 4 years, there were 3 Republican women and me. So for 4 years, I served as the only woman Democrat in Michigan, in the Michigan Senate. But I made sure that I had this goal to find something I could work with every single one of my colleagues on the Republican side. I was going to find a bill, an appropriation, something, a package. I was going to work with every single one of my colleagues. I made that a personal goal, and I went through 8 years, like ticking them off. And I tell you, it got hard at some point because some of my colleagues and we only have 1% of values in common, maybe 10%, but there were some where I dug really deep and hard. And I'll tell you that this will say something, I think, to your participants. One of my colleagues, what I ended up finding that I could work on was unarmed combat.
Okay,
right? Coming again from very different ways. We have this robust now amateur mixed martial arts, like unarmed combat. So boxing, I think boxing, but the sort of all of the iterations of that. Now we have this robust amateur unarmed combat kind of sports coming more and more to fruition at this time, and there's very little regulation around it. So he came at it from, he wanted our amateurs to be able to be professionals at some point. So we needed some regulations so that there were fights that were defined in such a way as to put them on a track to be professionals. I came at it from the perspective of safety. I wanted an at the ring physician, so which we have in the professionals do, but the amateurs didn't. So if something goes wrong or goes right, somebody lands a punch just right, that there'd be a medical professional on scene right there. This was also at the time where we had a couple of national stories about pregnant female fighters that didn't know they were pregnant, got into the ring and had some situations. So I wanted to make sure we had pregnancy tests as part of this, so women sort of knew what situations they were getting into. So unarmed combat. Who knew that would be the package that we would work on together? But it checked that one last colleague of mine off the list. So
I love the story of digging deep and finding that common ground. It's in there somewhere.
And so here's the thing, right? This is the advice that I would give. Like, honestly, first and foremost, um, knowing knowing for yourself your core values and being unwilling to budge, right? That is the hallmark of my career. Is there's never been a single time I voted against one of my core values. And that is really, truly important. Having enough starch in your spine to stand up when the things you care about are under attack, not being a shrinking violet, being willing to articulate that and share that with your colleagues, with your constituents is truly the important grounding, right? That's the touchstone. Then saying, you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. There's going to be moments where I think of social change as a marathon. It's not a sprint. So on some of the big issues that we want to make progress on, if we can get the first mile done today, or it can get 2 miles done today, those are 2 miles we don't have to run tomorrow. So being able to work with people to make things better kind of as we go forward is truly important. And surrounding yourself with good people so that you have, I feel like I can be ready in a moment's notice to wade into a new issue because I've got great personal staff. I've got great relationships in the advocacy community, and be ready to take the moment when it shows itself, right? Be ready to have an amendment introduced or an appropriation slipped into a supplemental bill to achieve a goal that you really care about. Because some of the things that we did over my 14 years were those, hey, we've just got to find an appropriation to keep the wetlands program in Michigan. Like Governor Granholm was considering ceding that authority back to the feds because of the impact on general fund budget. And there was a group of us that said, that just leaves acres and acres of wetlands, the smaller wetlands, unprotected in Michigan, which is unacceptable to so many of us who know how important that the role that the wetlands play in filtering our water and keeping our water quality high. So finding that moment to grab and invest in. So yeah, be grounded, find ways to work with people and try to do the golden rule thing. Because once you step on the toes of some folks with big egos who have gavels, you might never get a bill again if you do.
This idea of common ground, I think, is increasingly important in the environmental movement. We've seen for years polling that puts concern about water issues at the top of the citizens' priority list. Recently, the Proposal 1 campaign to expand the Natural Resources Trust Fund passed with 84% of the vote. There's a strong environment and conservation ethic in Michigan, and there's still a lot to do. We are seeing emerging issues like PFAS contamination that needs a state response that is strong and durable. We are facing near crises with our water infrastructure. There's a lot of important issues that could be on the table given the apparent strong public support for them. What do you think the next legislature, which you're not going to be a part of, should be tackling? Where is there real opportunity on the environment and conservation front that is going to be left on the table?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about the water infrastructure, and one of the things that Patty and I worked on when we were working on the Great Lakes Compact was this messaging point that somehow economic development and jobs and the economy and that natural resource and environmental protection somehow have to be at loggerheads. And what we argued instead is that taking care of our natural resources and environment actually can lead to job creation. And this water infrastructure focus is a once in a generation opportunity to deal with water quality, water quantity, and be an enormous jobs program, right? It's almost like a once in a generation kind of investment that we could make. So that is incredibly important, and I think something that we should find some broad consensus around. Obviously, it's expensive, and getting folks to be prepared to make that kind of financial investment is huge. But there is a path there. I think we still have a lot to do in terms of water quality. We're still cleaning up, as as Patty Burkholz once said, I loved this, the sins of our fathers. And as that group of women who worked on this issue, 100+ years ago, the industry, the areas of concern that still exist that need to be cleaned up were created by pollution that was, put in our environment 100+ years ago. And we still need to make progress on cleaning those up. We need to make progress on invasive species. And as you said, Conan, about these, sort of forever chemicals that are ending up in our environment, whether it's 1,4-dioxane, like we have in our backyard here in Washtenaw County, PFAS, the green ooze that we had to address and continue to address. There are a lot of those sort of regulatory issues that we need to work on. And so there's plenty of work still to be done. You're going to need environmental champions to continue, and there are amazing ones that are being elected all over the state right now. We got a great new crop coming in January, but continuing the strong work that you do, MEC, as the voice of the environment at the Capitol, right? Getting to know those folks, talking about your environmental agenda, supporting them as they go forward, and frankly, holding all of us as policymakers accountable for the things that we do, and the votes that we take is really important. So I know you'll have a lot of success going forward, continuing that work.
We also believe there's a stronger movement to be built. Do you have any advice for the advocates that you worked with over the many years about how we can be more effective in working with the legislature?
I think the most important thing, as I said, sort of is that this is a relationship business, getting to know people early and getting to know, what's important to legislators and their community. I think, so much of what we do doesn't just happen in Lansing, in the capital city. It's our communities. So finding those places where you can be engaged in helping identify and support those local issues as well that feed into, I think, the statewide policy changes. And again, you look across the state, there's from septic systems to these sort of chemicals in the environment, to lead. We still have lead mitigation work to do in lots of places around the state, whether that's water or paint. You're going to find, I think, ways to work with legislators. But I think increasingly the connection of environment and public health, right, from how we generate energy to all of these other pollutants in the environment, like making those sort of less traditional allies part of the workaday plan that we're looking at the whole spectrum of human health and environmental health at the same time. I feel like has a lot of potential to be an area of growth.
I love that. Senator, thank you so much for taking time with us today. And thank you for 14 years of incredible service. Michigan is a better place for having you in the legislature.
Thank you. It has been a true pleasure, and I cannot believe it's been 14 years already. So here comes the next chapter.
And we can't wait to see what you do next. And to everyone on the Zoom today, thank you for joining us for this very special legacy interview with Senator Rebekah Warren. It has been a real pleasure, ma'am. Take care.
Thank you.